Want some horror and humor with your sci-fi thriller? Look no further than David Koepp's Cold Storage, a debut novel that New York Times bestselling author Blake Crouch once called sheer thrillery goodness. I don't know if thrillery is a word. I don't care. I'm all for it. I'm on board. What makes this book such sheer thrillery goodness? That is what we're going to break down today on this Slade review. If you want to skip ahead, I got the chapters down below. But by the end of it, you'll understand why. If you love horror, humor, and sci-fi, David Koepp's Cold Storage is a must read. I'm Damien. Let's get into it. As always, we're going to break down 5 things: plot, character development, setting, action, and pacing using the sleigh scale. 1 sleigh is very, very bad. 5 sleighs is top notch, top marks. All right. So that's the scale that we're going to use for David Koepp's Cold Storage, starting with the plot. The plot is actually very similar to Michael Crichton's Andromeda Strain with a slight significant tweak. So the story starts in 1987, about a decade after the US space station Skylab basically disintegrated and came crashing back down to Earth, something that actually happened and was a real thing. You can look it up. Well, parts of the lab end up falling in this very, very remote Western Australian town. Parts that include an oxygen tank that had been sent to space with this fungus inside of it as part of a research project. Somehow, while in space, that fungus underwent some changes so that by the time it crashes back down to Earth, it has become this deadly, highly mutative new species. Well, the fungus ends up killing the entire town. So to ensure that it doesn't become any more of a problem, the government, the US government, firebombs the whole town, but not before it takes a sample of the fungus for itself, burying that sample deep, deep, deep under the earth in these caves in Kansas called the Atchison Mines, where the temperature down there is so cold the fungus has no choice but to remain dormant. Flash to present day, and the US government has now sold all of the land where the caves are located to private companies, and there's a public storage facility sitting on top of where the fungus is buried. And with climate change and with the temperatures rising, sure enough, the caves below start warming up and the fungus wakes up. The fungus gets out, it's hungry, and it starts to feed, and it's up to an ex-con, a single mom, and a now 68-year-old former military hotshot who helped originally contain it to stop the spread of this fungus before it destroys the world as we know it. So that's the plot of Cold Storage. It is a familiar plot with some different characters. It is a very linear story, which means there's a definitive beginning, middle, and end. And overall, I just really enjoyed it. So I'm going to give the plot 4.5 sleighs. Let's talk about character development. Really, there are 3 main characters in Cold Storage, starting with Roberto Diaz. When we meet him, Roberto, he is a 30-something government agent of the Defense Nuclear Agency, and David Koepp describes him as such. He got shit done. The future was all he thought about, planned for, obsessed over. And it's Roberto and his partner Trini who are responsible for containing the fungus out in Western Australia. And it's Roberto who gets the phone call 30 plus years later when temperature gauges inside the caves start beeping and the fungus gets out. He is the one, bad back and all, who is tasked with having to neutralize the problem. There's not too much of an arc for Roberto, but that's okay. He's a very likable guy, even though at the very, very beginning he might have a little bit of a rusted moral compass. That compass gets cleaned off towards the middle, and by the end of the book, for sure. He's a guy that has to make the tough decisions, and he does make those decisions without any hesitation. And because of who he is and what he's been through, I wrote a note saying that he was basically the grandpa you loved because he was the grandpa with the cool stories. The second main character and the third main character are Tea Cake and Naomi. And these two are really the heart, the emotional heartbeat of Cold Storage. Tea Cake is sort of this fast-talking ex-con who works as a security guard at the storage facility. Basically, this harmless good guy who just makes really, really bad decisions. The same could be said for Naomi. She is a single mom working the night shift as a security guard at this facility as well. She also wants to be a veterinarian, so she's got bigger dreams, bigger goals, bigger aspirations. Like I said, these two are the heart of Cold Storage. They give the emotional arc to the story. They don't know each other in the beginning, and by the end of it, they either choose to or are forced to do some of the most incredible things within the plot together. And the last character I have to mention is the fungus itself, because yes, you do have the opportunity to get inside the head of the fungus, how the fungus thinks, what the fungus recognizes, how the fungus adapts, morphs, and is able to spread so quickly. And this fungus is the villain of the story. So getting inside and having an understanding of how it works is incredibly interesting. So for character development, for sure, I'm going to give it 4 slays. For setting, there are 2 primary settings. Western Australia at the beginning of the book, where you're introduced to the fungus, but you spend 3/4 of the book inside this storage facility. And it is it's an interesting contrast, because you've got this wide expanse of the Australian desert. Meanwhile, inside the storage facility, you basically feel like you're imprisoned. It's like the walls are closing in on you at all times. It's got this very claustrophobic feeling. Both feel like they could be something out of scary zombie movies. Both work, and given the circumstances, it's not like I'd want to visit either place, to be honest. So I'm going to go ahead and give the setting of Cold Storage 3 slays. As far as action is concerned, there is a good amount of horror type action. A lot of bodies imploding, a lot of bodies exploding, animals, humans. There are actually weapon standoffs, gun standoffs. There are a few chase scenes. An old woman does, in fact, fire off a Glock and send an infected dude to his demise. And also, it is interesting to observe the action of the fungus itself as it evolves, as it learns and adapts and figures out different ways to live on and spread more rapidly. So, for the action in Cold Storage, I'm going to give it 3.5 slays. As far as pacing goes with Cold Storage, this is a good example of a book being top heavy at the beginning and much more lean toward the end. There are a lot of breaks in the beginning for backstory. You learn a lot about these characters and where they came from. The backstory on Tea Cake, how he ended up working at the storage facility, how he got the nickname Tea Cake. The backstory on Naomi and how she ended up a single mom. And there are also backstories on seemingly less important characters that at times kind of drag down the pacing a little bit. There were times where my eyes sort of glazed over and I just kind of had to skip reading or skip forward, or at least go back and reread to make sure that I didn't miss anything. But once you hit a certain point of the story, especially when you move into the climax, when Koepp puts the pedal fully to the floor and you're on the clock in more ways than one, and the stakes are at the highest, that's when the pacing feels the most taut. So for pacing, I'm going to give it 4 slays. So would I recommend David Koepp's Cold Storage? Yes. Big time yes. Capital Y, yes. But also for 2 reasons that we really haven't talked about: the horror and the humor. There are some disgustingly stomach-turning scenes in Cold Storage. And then there's the humor, which takes this book to a whole other level. The humor is very deadpan. It is legit funny, and it shows that the book knows exactly what it is, and it doesn't take itself too seriously. There is also, I must say, there is plenty of science to kind of go along with that horror and that humor, but it's not so overbearing that it bogs things down. It's actually necessary and helps you better understand what exactly is going on, and also brings a sense of legitimacy to the story as well. Ultimately, though, it is a very fun read. It's a roller coaster of a ride kind of read. I highly recommend it. Now, chances are, even if you've never heard of David Koepp, the author of Cold Storage, you probably are familiar with his work. If you have seen the trailer for Jurassic World Rebirth starring Scarlett Johansson, David Koepp is the guy who wrote the screenplay. In fact, David Koepp was the guy Steven Spielberg hired to replace Michael Crichton to write the original screenplay for the original blockbuster movie, Jurassic Park. Koepp also played a hand in writing the script for Tom Cruise's first Mission Impossible. He wrote Tobey Maguire's first Spider-Man. In 2025, as we're recording this video, Koepp has 2 more movies He's got one, both of them directed by Steven Soderbergh. One is the ghost story Presence, and the second, which is one that I'm actually very excited about, it's the espionage thriller starring Michael Fassbender and Cate Blanchett called Black Bag. So those are both David Koepp screenplays. That said, Cold Storage was David Koepp's first published novel, published back in September of 2019, and allegedly, supposedly, reportedly, he told Den of Geek that kind of the inspiration for at least one of the characters in this story came about after he was walking down a New York City street at 7 a.m. in August. He said he came across a guy wearing this security uniform looking absolutely miserable, a guy like in his early 20s who looked like he hated his job. But then he started thinking, what if the guy worked the night shift somewhere when something horrible happens? Something that forces our security guard to take ownership of his job. It's a terrible job. He hates his job, but it's his terrible job, so he's going to do it right. That would be a character Koepp said he would want to follow. Then Koepp did this interview with Space.com saying that like this alleged battle between him and this Asiatic root, this plant that got blown into his neighborhood courtesy of Hurricane Sandy, kind of gave him a spark of an idea, because I guess this specific kind of plant can grow 6 inches a day, and no matter how many times he pulled the roots out, it still kept reviving. So that gave him at least some inspiration for Cold Storage's plot. Now, at last checked, Cold Storage was in fact greenlit to become a movie starring Liam Neeson, but at the time we are recording this video, no release date has been set, and there haven't been any sort of production notes that I can find, so who knows what's going on with that. Ultimately, though, David Koepp's Cold Storage, like I said, is just a pure fun read. It's got horror, it's got humor, it's got sci-fi, and it's got suspense. If you haven't read Cold Storage just yet, did this video help convince you to give that book a try? Just give me a yes or no in the comments section below. And if you have read Cold Storage, tell me what you thought about the book and whether or not you agreed with this Slade review. Thanks so much for stopping by, and I will see you right here next time on Slade Pages.